In the years before the Revolution, life in the American colonies carried with it a rhythm that felt both simple and steady, marked by the turning of the seasons, the rising and setting of the sun, and the quiet routines of daily work. Families lived in modest homes built from wood, often with 1 or 2 main rooms, where a fire kept away the chill in winter and where meals were prepared in iron pots that hung gently over the flames. Children awoke at dawn to help with chores, and the days were filled with tasks that might seem ordinary to us now, but which formed the very foundation of existence then. Water was fetched from a well, animals were tended in barns and pastures, and fields were prepared for planting, their soil turned carefully by hand or with the help of horses and oxen. The smell of fresh earth lingered in the air, and the sound of farm tools carried softly across the countryside. In towns, small shops lined narrow streets, selling goods that had come by ship across the Atlantic, along with items made by local craftsmen. Shoes carefully stitched, tools hammered from iron, and furniture shaped with care. Evenings were often quiet. Families gathered by candlelight, the warm glow of tallow or beeswax filling the room with a gentle softness. There were no clocks ticking in every corner, no hum of machinery, no distant engines on roads, only the occasional crackle of a fire, the sound of a fiddle at a gathering, or the murmur of voices in conversation. Neighbors shared news with one another, stories about weather and crops, sometimes about births, marriages, or losses, and sometimes about faraway matters carried by newspapers or travelers from other colonies. The colonies stretched along the eastern edge of a vast continent, their towns and villages scattered along coasts, rivers, and forests. The ocean was never far away, and in the harbours, tall ships stood at anchor, their masts swaying with the tide. These ships brought goods from Britain, cloth, tools, books, and tea, and in return carried away timber, furs, fish, and grain from the colonies. The water was both a link and a distance, connecting the people of America to Britain, yet reminding them daily of how far apart they truly were. Religion and community were at the center of much of colonial life. On Sundays, families traveled by foot, horse, or wagon to wooden meeting houses, where services were long and solemn, but also served as gatherings for the entire community. Afterward, people lingered to exchange news, to trade, and to strengthen ties that bound neighbors together. Education, too, held importance, though it varied from place to place. In New England, small schools taught children to read, often so they could study scripture, while in other regions, learning took place at home, passed down through family. The colonies were not all the same. In the northern regions, with their rocky soil and cooler climate, towns were more compact, and people often relied on trade, fishing, and small farms. In the middle colonies, where the land was fertile, large fields of grain stretched wide, and bustling cities like Philadelphia and New York grew with busy docks and lively marketplaces. In the southern colonies, plantations spread across broad fields, where tobacco, rice, and indigo grew in the sun. Enslaved Africans labored there in great numbers, their presence shaping the land and its economy in ways both enduring and tragic. Though life could be hard, it also carried moments of beauty. In spring, orchards blossomed with flowers and children played barefoot in the grass. In summer, fields turned green and full, while rivers sparkled in the warm sun. Autumn brought harvests, with wagons filled high and celebrations marked by food and music. Winter, though harsh, carried its own quiet comfort, with snow blanketing the earth, fires burning steadily, and families gathered closely indoors. It was in this world, gentle yet demanding, ordinary yet alive with small wonders, that thoughts of independence slowly began to stir. For most people, life was about survival and community, not politics or distant kings. Yet in the corners of taverns and in the pages of pamphlets, questions began to appear. Why should laws be made an ocean away? Why should taxes be collected without a voice in the decision? At first, these were quiet musings, barely more than whispers. But as the years went by, they spread slowly, like a breeze passing through tall grass, soft but steady. Travelers carried these ideas along dirt roads that linked towns, where inns provided food, rest, and conversation. Merchants discussed them as they unloaded crates and barrels at harbors. Farmers spoke of them after market day, their words lingering as they rode home, in wagons creaking along the road. And though most still considered themselves loyal subjects of the king, the seeds of change had been planted, taking root in soil that was ready for growth. In these early days, no one could have predicted the long struggle ahead. The colonists lived their lives, tending their fields, raising their children, and building their communities, even as small ripples of discontent began to widen across the land. The revolution had not yet come, but in the quiet routines of daily life, the stage was being set for what would one day reshape not only the colonies, but the entire world. And as night fell upon the homes of farmers, merchants, sailors, and townsfolk, as candles were extinguished and families drifted into sleep, the colonies rested in the gentle pause before history began to quicken its pace. The air carried the same sounds it had for decades, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of trees swaying in the breeze, and the steady rhythm of life. But beneath the surface, change was coming, and with it, the story that would become the American Revolution. As the years passed, and the colonies grew in number and population, their relationship with Britain remained both familiar and strained. On one hand, the people of the colonies still saw themselves as British in many ways. They spoke the same language, read the same books, and shared the same traditions. On the other hand, the vast ocean between them made life in the colonies feel different, more independent, and more self-reliant. This sense of distance, while not always spoken aloud, quietly shaped how colonists saw themselves, and over time, it became harder to ignore. The British government, facing debts from wars in Europe and in North America, began to look across the sea for revenue. The colonies had prospered, and it seemed reasonable from the perspective of Parliament that they should contribute more directly to the empire's expenses. Yet for the colonists, these new taxes and regulations felt intrusive, especially because they had little voice in how the decisions were made. The first of these measures that stirred wide discontent was the Sugar Act of 1764, which placed duties on sugar and molasses imported into the colonies. For many colonists, especially merchants and traders, this act was more than just a matter of money. It was a reminder that decisions affecting their livelihood were being made far away, without their consent. People began to talk more openly about the principle that would soon become a familiar phrase: no taxation without representation. The following year, the Stamp Act of 1765 arrived, and with it, a new level of frustration. The act required that many printed materials, from newspapers to legal documents, from playing cards to pamphlets, carry an official stamp to show that a tax had been paid. For ordinary colonists, this was not just an inconvenience. It touched daily life, adding cost to the paper they read, the contracts they signed, and even the cards they shuffled in games with family and friends. The very fabric of everyday experience seemed to bear the mark of British control. Protests spread quietly but steadily. In town squares and meeting halls, colonists gathered to discuss what this meant for their future. Some wrote petitions, carefully worded letters to Parliament, expressing their discontent in respectful tones. Others chose more direct forms of resistance, refusing to buy stamped papers, organizing boycotts, and forming groups such as the Sons of Liberty, who used persuasion, and sometimes intimidation, to discourage compliance with the act. Merchants and shopkeepers joined in, refusing to import British goods, And the boycott gave ordinary people a sense of power they had rarely felt before. In homes, families chose to make do with simpler clothing or local substitutes, rather than purchase items from Britain. What had once been simply economic decisions now carried a deeper meaning. Each choice became a quiet statement about identity and self-determination. The protests grew strong enough that Britain eventually repealed the Stamp Act, but the relief was brief. In its place came the Declaratory Act of 1766, which asserted Parliament's right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. For colonists, this felt like a reminder that the power to control them still rested firmly in London. Soon after came the Townshend Acts of 1767, which imposed duties on everyday items such as glass, paper, paint, and tea. These goods were part of daily life, and the taxes once again stirred resentment. Boycotts resumed, this time more organized and widespread. Women played an especially important role, forming groups often called the Daughters of Liberty, who encouraged households to produce their own goods, weaving homespun cloth and preparing alternatives to imported products. In parlors and kitchens, simple acts of spinning yarn or brewing herbal tea carried with them a quiet but profound sense of resistance. The presence of British soldiers in colonial towns added another layer of tension. In Boston in particular, red-coated soldiers marched through the streets, a visible reminder of authority. While some interactions were civil, others were uneasy, with small quarrels breaking out between townspeople and soldiers. The sight of men in uniform, carrying muskets and enforcing laws from afar, made the air feel heavy, as if something larger was looming just beyond the horizon. The situation reached a grim moment in 1770, when an altercation in Boston escalated into violence. Colonists had gathered, voices raised, snowballs and stones thrown, and in the confusion, soldiers fired their muskets into the crowd. Several colonists were killed, and though the event was later called the Boston Massacre, its details were quieter and more complex than the name suggests. Still, the image of soldiers firing upon civilians spread quickly, carried by pamphlets and engravings, and it became a symbol of colonial grievance. After the Townshend duties were repealed on most goods, the tax on tea remained. To Parliament, it was a small matter, but to colonists, it was a reminder that the principle of taxation without consent had not gone away. In 1773, the Tea Act gave the British East India Company the right to sell tea directly to the colonies at a lower price, but with the tax intact. For many colonists, it was not the cost, but the principle that mattered. Accepting the tea meant accepting Parliament's authority. That December, a group of colonists, dressed to conceal their identities, boarded ships in Boston Harbor under the cover of night. With quiet determination, they opened crates of tea and tipped them into the dark waters below. The harbor carried the scent of tea leaves soaking in the tide, and though the act was carried out without great violence, it spoke loudly across the colonies and back to Britain. It became known as the Boston Tea Party, and with it, the conflict deepened. Britain responded with what the colonists called the Intolerable Acts of 1774. And these measures closed the port of Boston until the tea was paid for, altered the Massachusetts government to tighten British control, and allowed soldiers to be housed in private homes. For many colonists, these acts confirmed what they had begun to suspect, that their liberties were being steadily eroded. In response, colonial leaders gathered at the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Delegates from 12 colonies met to discuss how to respond. They did not yet declare independence, but they agreed to stand together to organize boycotts and to petition the king once more. For the first time, the colonies acted not only as separate provinces, but as a united group, speaking with a shared voice. These years of taxes, protests, boycotts, and debates shaped the spirit of the colonies. They taught ordinary men and women that their actions, however small, could carry weight. A decision not to buy imported cloth, a refusal to drink taxed tea, or a meeting held in a quiet town hall, each of these was part of a growing sense of unity and determination. As night settled over the towns and farms of America, the seeds of revolution were already firmly planted. The people still tilled their fields, still mended their clothes, still told stories by firelight, but now their conversations carried a new tone. Questions once whispered grew louder, and the idea that the colonies might one day stand on their own no longer seemed impossible. The world was shifting gently, steadily towards something new. And though the final break had not yet come, it was drawing closer with each passing season, carried forward not only by grand speeches and bold acts, but also by the quiet strength of countless ordinary people who simply wished to live with freedom and dignity. In the early 1770s, the town of Boston had become one of the most restless corners of the colonies. Its narrow streets, lined with wooden houses and busy shops, echoed with the sound of carts rattling over cobblestones, sailors calling to one another as they carried goods from the docks, and neighbors exchanging news on corners where lamps glowed faintly at night. It was a lively town, full of energy and trade, but beneath its daily rhythm lay a growing sense of unease, for here the presence of British authority was felt most keenly. Red-coated soldiers walked the streets, their boots tapping steadily on the stone, their muskets resting against their shoulders. They were not only guardians of order, but also living reminders of a distant king's will. To some, their presence offered protection, and to others it felt like a constant intrusion, a shadow over daily life. In markets and taverns, whispers of discontent grew, and even in quiet homes, the sight of soldiers at every corner stirred thoughts of what it meant to live freely. The tension that had been building found its breaking point on a cold evening in March of 1770. Snow still lingered on the ground, and the air was sharp with winter's chill. In the streets, a small group of colonists began to argue with a British sentry. Voices rose, footsteps gathered, and what began as a handful of men soon grew into a crowd. Some carried sticks, others hurled snowballs packed hard with ice, and their shouts echoed against the buildings. The soldiers, standing with their muskets, felt the weight of the crowd pressing closer. Orders were confused, and the night air filled with noise, shouts from the colonists, calls from the soldiers, the scrape of boots shifting nervously on the stone. Then suddenly shots rang out. Smoke drifted from the muskets, and when it cleared, several colonists lay on the ground, their lives taken in the sudden burst of violence. This event, which would come to be known as the Boston Massacre, was not a great battle but a small and tragic clash, born of mistrust, anger, and fear. Yet its impact rippled far beyond that street. Pamphlets and newspapers spread the news quickly, and artists etched engravings that showed the soldiers firing into a helpless crowd. The image was powerful, and though it did not tell every detail as it truly happened, it captured the feelings of the colonists, a sense that they were being oppressed by armed force. In taverns and parlors, the story was told again and again, and some spoke of justice and called for trials, while others used the event as proof that the colonies could no longer trust the authority that ruled them. For ordinary families, it was a sobering reminder that the tension with Britain was no longer only about taxes and laws, but about safety, dignity, and the very right to walk their streets without fear. Even after the massacre, life in Boston went on. Ships still arrived in the harbor, carrying goods from distant ports. Children still played in the alleys and fields, their laughter rising above the sounds of horses and wagons. But the memory of that night lingered like a shadow, And with each passing season, it deepened the conviction among many that change was necessary. Only a few years later, another event would once again stir the waters of Boston Harbor and echo across the colonies. The matter at hand was tea, a simple, everyday drink that warmed households and brought comfort to many. Yet through the quiet act of steeping leaves in hot water, the larger questions of power and principle unfolded. The Tea Act of 1773 was intended by Parliament as a solution to a problem. The British East India Company, struggling with unsold tea, was given the right to ship it directly to the colonies at a reduced price. And to many, this might have seemed like a small benefit, cheaper tea for households. But to the colonists, it carried a different meaning. The tax remained, and by accepting the tea, they would be accepting Parliament's right to tax them without their consent. Meetings were held in Boston, where townspeople gathered in large numbers to discuss what should be done. In Faneuil Hall, and later in the Old South Meeting House, voices filled the air with calm but firm debate. Should the ships be sent back? Should the tea be left to spoil? Or should some stronger action be taken? The rooms were crowded, candles flickering against the wooden walls, as men spoke of liberty, duty, and principle. On the night of December 16th, 1773, a group of colonists, their faces disguised, made their way quietly to the harbor. The moon reflected faintly on the water as they approached, the ships carrying the tea. Moving with determination, but without loud commotion, they boarded the vessels, pried open the wooden chests, and tipped the tea into the sea. The dark water carried the leaves gently away, the harbor filling with the faint scent of the drink that had long been a daily comfort in so many homes. The act was not one of destruction for its own sake. It was symbolic, a clear and unmistakable statement that the colonies would not submit to taxation without representation. There was no great shouting, no loud celebration, only the steady work of men tipping crate after crate until the job was done. Then, just as quietly they left, disappearing into the night, leaving behind the harbor stained with tea and history changed forever. News of the Boston Tea Party, as it came to be called, spread with remarkable speed. In distant towns, farmers heard of it at markets, merchants discussed it at docks, and families spoke of it by their firesides. To some, it was a bold and noble act. To others, it was reckless. But few could deny its power. The colonies had drawn a line, and Britain could not ignore it. The response was swift. Parliament passed measures that the colonists would call the Intolerable Acts. The port of Boston was closed until the destroyed tea was paid for, striking at the heart of the town's livelihood. The Charter of Massachusetts was altered, giving Britain tighter control over its government. Soldiers could be housed in private homes, and trials could be moved away from local juries. To many colonists, these laws felt less like justice and more like punishment, a heavy hand placed firmly on their shoulders. Yet rather than silence Boston, the acts brought the colonies closer together. Sympathy poured in from other provinces, with food and supplies, sent to help the town endure the closing of its port. Leaders from across the colonies began to meet, gathering in Philadelphia at the First Continental Congress in 1774. Here, they spoke not only of Boston's troubles, but of the larger questions that touched them all. In calm but determined voices, they agreed to stand united. They organized new boycotts, pledging not to import British goods. They drafted petitions, carefully addressed to the king, asking once more for fairness and recognition. And though they did not yet declare independence, the sense of shared identity had grown stronger than ever before. For ordinary people, the years around the massacre and the Tea Party were years of uncertainty, but also of awakening. In kitchens and workshops, in fields and harbors, people felt more deeply than before that their daily lives were tied to decisions made across the ocean. The tea they drank, the paper they wrote upon, the very goods they purchased all carried with them questions of principle. The revolution had not yet begun in open battle, but the spirit of resistance was alive. It lived in the memory of those lost in Boston's snowy street, in the sight of tea leaves floating on the harbour tide, and in the gathering of voices that now spoke together more than ever before. And so, as candles flickered low in homes across the colonies, and as families drifted into rest, there was a new awareness in the air. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was also shared. The colonies, once separate in many ways, were finding strength in unity, and the gentle but steady steps toward independence were now impossible to reverse. The year was 1775, and spring was just beginning to settle upon the Massachusetts countryside. The snow that had lingered in corners of fields and along stone walls was melting away, leaving behind damp earth that smelled rich and heavy, a signal that planting season was not far off. In the villages of Lexington and Concord, life moved in its familiar rhythm, with farmers rising before the sun to tend their animals, children gathering kindling for the morning fire, and neighbours pausing on dirt roads to exchange quiet greetings before returning to their daily work. The air was crisp in the mornings, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and damp soil, and though the world felt steady, a quiet undercurrent of unease moved just beneath the surface of everyday life. For many months, tensions had been growing between the colonies and Britain, yet in these small communities, the concerns of politics often mingled with the concerns of planting, mending, and trading. Men might discuss the latest news of Parliament while sharpening a plough blade, or speak of taxes while repairing a fence. The conversations were not filled with shouts or anger, but with a kind of steady worry, a recognition that decisions made across the ocean were reaching into the quietest corners of village life. Still, the daily rhythm continued, as it always had, until the morning of April 19th brought with it a change that could not be turned back. That morning began like many others, with the first lights spreading gently across the horizon, touching the tops off trees and slipping into the windows of small wooden houses. Birds stirred in the hedges, roosters called from farmyards, and smoke began to curl from chimneys as families prepared their breakfasts. Yet there was something different in the air, a sense of expectancy, a stillness that seemed to linger just a little longer than usual. In Lexington, a group of local militia, often called Minutemen, because they were said to be ready at a moment's notice, gathered on the village green. They were not soldiers in the professional sense. Most were farmers, blacksmiths or shopkeepers, men who knew one another by name and who lived side by side in the same community. Their coats were of different colours, their weapons varied, and though they stood with a sense of resolve, there was also a quiet nervousness among them. Down the road, the sound of marching feet grew steadily louder. The British soldiers, dressed in their bright red coats, approached with disciplined steps, their muskets glinting faintly in the pale morning light. To the villagers watching from windows and doorways, the sight was both familiar and unsettling, for these were not strangers, but representatives of the government that had long ruled the colonies. Yet now they were here not as distant symbols of authority, but as a physical presence, walking along their very roads, entering their very towns. The two groups faced one another across the green, the silence between them heavy and uncertain. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, holding both sides in a fragile stillness. The Minutemen, standing with their muskets at rest, did not seek to begin a battle, and the British soldiers, moving under orders, did not intend for this village square to become a battlefield. The air was cool, the grass still damp with dew, and the sounds of nature, birds calling, a horse shifting its weight, the creak of a wagon in the distance, continued as if unaware of the tension that filled the space between the two lines of men. It was a moment balanced on the edge of possibility, where perhaps nothing need happen, where perhaps both groups could part without bloodshed. But then, into that stillness, a single shot rang out. No one could later say with certainty who fired it, or even from which side it came. Some said it might have been an accidental discharge. Others suggested it was the act of one man's nervousness. But whatever its origin, its sound broke the fragile calm of the morning. In an instant, the air filled with confusion. Muskets cracked, smoke drifted across the green, and men who'd moments before stood in uneasy silence now found themselves in the midst of a skirmish. The exchange was brief, lasting only minutes, and when the smoke cleared, the green was once again quiet, though now it carried with it the weight of loss. For those who lived in Lexington, the moment was both surreal and sorrowful. This had not been a battlefield in the distant sense, but the very heart of their community, a place where children had played, where neighbors had gathered, and where daily life had unfolded for generations. Now it bore the marks of conflict, a reminder that the tensions of politics and governance had reached even into the most familiar spaces. The British soldiers moved on, continuing their march toward Concord, while the villagers tended to the fallen and tried to comprehend the change that had just taken place. At Concord, later that same day, the pattern repeated itself in a different form. The British sought supplies that had been stored there, while the local militia gathered to resist. Bridges became the setting of tense standoffs, and shots were again exchanged. Here, too, the fighting was brief compared to later battles, yet its meaning was profound. These early clashes were not decisive in the military sense, but they carried a significance far beyond their scale. They marked the beginning of open conflict, the moment when words and petitions gave way to musket fire, and when the colonies crossed a threshold that could not be reversed. For the men who fired their weapons that day, there was no clear sense of victory or defeat. Many were shaken by the violence, by the sight of friends and neighbors wounded or killed. Yet beneath the sorrow was also a recognition that something had shifted, that the relationship between the colonies and Britain would never again be what it had been. The path ahead was uncertain and filled with hardship, but it had been set in motion. The revolution, though not yet declared in words, had begun in action. In the days that followed, news of the clashes spread quickly. Riders carried the story from village to village, from colony to colony, until it became known not just in Massachusetts but throughout the 13 colonies. Families gathered around fires to hear the reports, their faces lit by the glow of candlelight as they listened in silence. Some felt fear, others felt resolve, but all understood that the world they knew was changing. It was not only the men who had stood on the green at Lexington or on the bridge at Concord who were touched by those events. It was every man, woman, and child who heard the news and realized that life in the colonies had entered a new chapter. And yet, even with this awareness, daily life did not vanish. Fields still needed to be plowed, bread still needed to be baked, and children still needed care. The revolution did not arrive as a single sweeping moment that transformed everything at once. It arrived gradually, settling into the fabric of ordinary life, intertwining with the rhythm of work and rest. The people carried on, even as they carried with them the memory of that April morning, the morning when silence gave way to gunfire, and when the first steps were taken on a long and uncertain path. When we look back upon that day now, it is often remembered in bold images and stirring words, but it is worth also remembering it in softer tones, as a moment of human hesitation, of ordinary men standing in extraordinary circumstances, unsure of what would come next. The shots fired at Lexington and Concord were not just the beginning of a war. They were the beginning of a transformation, one that grew slowly, like a seed planted in the soil, nurtured by time, patience, and the enduring hope for something better. And so, as the sun set that evening, casting long shadows across the fields and turning the sky to gentle shades of pink and gold, the people of Massachusetts returned to their homes with hearts heavy and minds unsettled. The day had begun in quiet routine, had passed through smoke and sorrow, and ended in reflection. It was only the first of many such days to come, yet in its stillness, it carried the weight of history. For in the soft air of an April dawn, in the mist of a village green, and in the echo of a single uncertain shot, the revolution had quietly begun. The months that followed the first shots at Lexington and Concord were filled with a kind of quiet weight, as if the air itself carried the knowledge that the colonies had crossed into something new and untested. The sound of muskets had faded, the smoke of those mornings had cleared, yet the memory remained, lingering in conversations spoken softly at tables and in thoughts carried silently as men walked behind their plows or women spun wool by firelight. Life in the villages of Massachusetts and across the other colonies carried on with its necessary rhythm. Fields still needed planting, children still played in yards and lanes, neighbors still greeted one another as they passed. But beneath these familiar tasks was the recognition that the old order had shifted. Something had begun that could not be easily undone. At first, the colonies were uncertain of what path to take. Some hoped for reconciliation, believing that perhaps, if grievances were clearly stated, the king and parliament would see reason and grant relief. Others, however, looked at the events of April and felt that the bond had already been broken, that words alone could no longer mend what musket fire had made plain. The months stretched on, filled with petitions and letters, with gatherings of colonial representatives who spoke late into the night, their candles flickering low as they weighed the risks of their choices. Each colony had its own concerns, its own interests to protect, yet they all shared the question of what lay ahead. In taverns and meeting houses, the talk of independence grew slowly, like a flame catching and kindling. At first it was cautious, almost whispered, for to speak too boldly was to step into dangerous ground. But as news spread, news of British reinforcements, of new restrictions, of the Crown's refusal to bend, the whispers grew louder until they became part of everyday speech. Men discussed it over mugs of ale, women shared their thoughts while gathering water at the well, and even children, overhearing fragments of conversation, sensed that something momentous was unfolding. The word independence carried with it both promise and fear, for it meant freedom, yes, but it also meant severing ties with the power that had long ruled the colonies. Writers played their part in shaping these thoughts, sending pamphlets and essays into the world that reached far beyond the walls in which they were written. Among them was Thomas Paine, whose pamphlet Common Sense spoke in clear and simple language, so plain that even those with little formal education could grasp its meaning. He argued not with lofty phrases, but with the steady voice of reason that it made no sense for a continent tobe ruled by a distant island, that kingship was not a natural order, and that the colonies had both the right and the ability to govern themselves. His words spread quickly, passed from hand to hand, read aloud in taverns and discussed in quiet homes, awakening in many the realization that independence was not a dream, but a practical possibility. By the summer of 1776, the momentum had become too great to ignore. Representatives from the 13 colonies gathered once again in Philadelphia, in the Pennsylvania State House, a building of brick and timber that would one day be called Independence Hall. The air was heavy with heat, the streets outside filled with the noise of horses and wagons, while inside the halls men debated with earnestness. These were not debates of pride or vanity alone, but of deep concern, for each man knew that what they decided would alter the lives of millions, not only in their own time, but for generations yet unborn. The debates were long and careful. Some argued that reconciliation was still possible, that declaring independence would invite destruction upon the colonies, whose armies were poorly supplied and poorly trained compared to Britain's might. Others countered that reconciliation had already been tried, that petitions had been sent and ignored, and that the time had come to take their fate into their own hands. The room filled with voices, sometimes rising, sometimes falling into long pauses as each representative weighed not only the arguments of others, but the voices of their own hearts. It was during these days that Thomas Jefferson was chosen to put into writing the declaration that would embody their decision. Jefferson was a man of quiet temperament, preferring the company of books and the solace of thought, yet his pen carried a clarity that gave shape to the sentiments of many. In the stillness of his rented room, by candlelight, he drafted words that spoke not only to his fellow colonists, but to the world at large, that all men were created equal, that they were endowed with certain unalienable rights, that among these were life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These were not words of anger, but of calm conviction, words that set forth the belief that governments derived their power from the consent of the governed, and that when they failed in that duty, the people had the right to alter or abolish them. When Jefferson's draft was read and revised, line by line, the representatives made changes, some small, some significant, yet the heart of the document remained. On July the 2nd, they voted for independence, and 2 days later, on July 4th, the Declaration of Independence was formally adopted. Outside, in the streets of Philadelphia, the news spread quickly and bells rang in celebration. Yet even in that moment of joy, there was a quiet solemnity, for the men who signed the document knew that their names were now attached to treason in the eyes of Britain. Each stroke of the quill was an act of courage, binding them not only to one another, but to the cause of a new nation. When the declaration was read aloud in public squares, crowds gathered, listening in silence as the words carried across the air. Some felt a swelling of pride, others a tightening of fear, but all understood that something irrevocable had taken place. The colonies were no longer subjects. They were declaring themselves to be states, united in their pursuit of self-governance. For ordinary men and women, the meaning was profound. Farmers paused in their fields, shopkeepers set down their goods, mothers held their children a little closer, and all considered the weight of the path that had been chosen. The call for independence was not only political, but deeply personal. It meant that families would be divided, as some remained loyal to Britain while others embraced the new cause. It meant that lives would be risked, that sacrifices would be required, that hardships would multiply before they eased. And yet it also meant that a dream long nurtured, the dream of living under laws chosen by the people themselves, was moving from possibility to reality. As the summer waned into autumn, and as the colonies prepared for the struggles ahead, the Declaration stood as a beacon, reminding them of why they endured. Its words were copied, printed, and carried across the land, pinned to tavern walls, tucked into Bibles, read aloud at gatherings. They were words of reassurance in dark times, reminding all who heard them that they were not fighting in vain, but striving for something larger than themselves. And so the call for independence was not a sudden cry, but a rising chorus, built slowly from whispers, strengthened by reason, and finally declared with steady resolve. It was not born only of battle, but of thought, of debate, of reflection, and of the quiet determination of ordinary people who longed for freedom. When we remember that moment now, it is tempting to see only the signatures, the parchment, the ringing bells. But perhaps it is gentler to recall also the stillness of Jefferson at his desk, the murmur of voices in the assembly hall, the hush of a crowd hearing the words for the first time. Independence was not only declared in ink, It was declared in the hearts of those who chose to believe that a new world could be built, slowly, patiently, and with hope. And as the sun set on July 4th, casting its warm light over the brick walls of Philadelphia and the quiet streets beyond, the colonies stood at the threshold of a future both uncertain and full of promise. The day had been long, the debates had been heavy, but the decision had been made. A new chapter had begun, written not in haste, but in steady strokes, as the voices of the colonies became the voice of a nation. When the Declaration of Independence was adopted and read aloud in the summer of 1776, it gave the colonies a sense of purpose and direction, yet it did not bring with it immediate security or ease. The words on parchment were powerful, but the road to making them real was long, uncertain, and often very difficult. The revolution, in truth, became a test not of a single battle or a single moment, but of endurance over many years. It stretched across the wide seasons of the land, from warm summers when soldiers marched in heat and dust, to winters when the ground was hard with frost and snow lay deep upon the fields. The men who formed the Continental Army were not professionals trained for long wars. They were farmers, craftsmen, teachers, and laborers, ordinary men who left behind families and livelihoods to take up arms. Their clothing was often mismatched, their weapons varied, and their supplies uncertain. Some marched barefoot, wrapping their feet in cloth when their shoes wore through, while others carried muskets passed down from fathers or borrowed from neighbors. And yet, they came together with a quiet determination, knowing that their strength lay not in uniforms or discipline alone, but in their shared belief that they were fighting for their own homes and for the future of their children. Life in the camps was difficult. Food was often scarce, with rations that might consist of salted meat, hard bread, and thin soup, if anything at all. The tents that sheltered the soldiers were small and draughty, offering little comfort against rain or snow. Illness spread easily in such close quarters, and many who never faced battle still suffered greatly from disease. Yet through these hardships, the men leaned on one another for comfort, sharing what little they had, singing songs to lighten their spirits, and writing letters home to remind themselves of what they were fighting for. In those moments of stillness, around campfires where the smoke drifted slowly upward into the night sky, there was both sorrow and fellowship, a reminder that endurance was as much about the heart as it was about the body. For the families who remained at home, the struggle was no less real. With husbands, fathers, and sons away at war, the work of tending farms, caring for children, and maintaining households fell upon those left behind. Women rose before dawn to milk cows, gather eggs, and bake bread, then spent long hours spinning wool, weaving cloth, and mending clothes, while also managing the planting and harvesting of crops. Children learned quickly to take on responsibilities, helping in the fields, or carrying water, learning to grow into the roles that circumstance required of them. Life was never easy in the colonies, but during the war, every task seemed heavier, every absence more deeply felt. And yet, like the soldiers in camp, families at home carried on, sustained by a quiet hope that their sacrifices would not be in vain. The war itself did not move in a straight line. There were victories that lifted spirits and defeats that cast shadows of doubt. One season might bring news of a triumph, while the next brought word of retreat. Towns and villages felt the ebb and flow of the conflict, sometimes welcoming soldiers as heroes, other times watching anxiously as enemy troops passed through their streets. For those living in the path of the armies, the war was not something distant, but something that pressed directly upon their lives, altering routines, consuming supplies, and leaving behind traces long after the soldiers had moved on. Through it all, there was a sense that time itself had slowed, that the revolution was less about sudden bursts of glory and more about enduring day after day, year after year. Letters carried news slowly from one place to another, so that families often waited weeks or months for word from loved ones. Rumors spread quickly, yet the truth was harder to know, and in this uncertainty people leaned upon faith, upon patience, and upon one another. The revolution was not only a military struggle, it was also a lesson in waiting, in holding to hope even when the outcome was unclear. Among the soldiers, moments of battle came suddenly, often after long periods of stillness. A march might last for days without incident, the men trudging through mud or dust, their minds filled with thoughts of home, only for the sound of drums or the call of officers to rouse them into formation. In battle, the world became a blur of smoke and sound, of muskets cracking and cannon booming, of commands shouted above the noise. Yet these moments, though intense, were often brief compared to the long hours of waiting that filled most of a soldier's life. The revolution, for many, was less a series of battles than a series of waits, interrupted now and then by flashes of violence. The patience required was immense. Soldiers waited for supplies, for reinforcements, for orders. Families waited for letters, for news, for the return of loved ones. Communities waited for signs that independence might truly be within reach. It was in this waiting that the revolution's true strength was found, for though hardships pressed hard, the people continued to endure. Each passing day of endurance was itself a quiet victory, a statement that they would not be broken by hunger, by cold, or by doubt. As the years passed, this long struggle became woven into the very fabric of colonial life. Children grew older while their fathers were away, farms changed hands, towns rebuilt what had been damaged. The war became not only a backdrop, but a constant presence, shaping choices and shaping lives. It was not a tale of swift triumph, but of steady perseverance, of countless small acts of courage and resilience that, together, sustained a cause far greater than any one person. And so, when we think of the revolution, it is easy to picture the great battles and the famous names, yet it is just as true to picture the quieter moments. A soldier warming his hands by a small fire, a mother teaching her child to weave cloth while thinking of her husband, a community gathering to share what little food they could spare. And these were the moments that carried the struggle forward, that gave it meaning, and that showed the true depth of the people's resolve. The long and patient struggle of the revolution was not marked by speed, but by endurance. It was the willingness to carry on when the outcome was uncertain, the ability to find strength in one another when supplies were low, and the quiet faith that, though the path was hard, it was leading toward a future worth the sacrifice. And as the seasons turned, as years slipped by with their mixture of hardship and hope, the people of the colonies discovered within themselves a resilience they had not known before. The revolution was shaping not only a nation, but also a character, a way of facing difficulty with patience, of meeting uncertainty with steady hearts, and of believing, even in the darkest hours, that light would come again. In this way, the revolution was not only a war of muskets and cannons, but a war of endurance, of waiting, of holding on. And it was in this long, patient struggle that the dream of independence was nurtured, slowly and quietly, until it was ready at last to be made real. When George Washington accepted command of the Continental Army, he did so not with shouts or grand gestures, but with the quiet seriousness of a man who understood the weight of what was being asked of him. He was tall, dignified, and reserved, a man whose presence alone often inspired those around him. Yet Washington was not a figure of noise or drama. He was a man of stillness, of patience, and of steady endurance. In a war that stretched over years and was filled with uncertainty, it was this calm steadiness that held the army together and gave shape to the fragile hope of the colonies. Washington's army was not, in those early years, a polished or professional force. It was a collection of farmers and craftsmen, of young men eager to prove themselves, and older men who felt a duty to defend their homes. They brought with them muskets of varying quality, coats and shoes in varying condition, and a determination that sometimes faltered under the strain of hunger, cold, or fear. Washington knew from the beginning that his task was not only to lead these men in battle, but to bind them into something more, an army that could stand against one of the most powerful military forces in the world. And he knew that such a task would not be accomplished quickly or easily. What set Washington apart was not only his skill as a commander, but his ability to remain steady in the face of adversity. Time and again, when defeats came or supplies ran short, when the army seemed on the verge of collapse, he did not give way to despair. Instead, he held himself with calm dignity, reassuring his men not always with words, but with presence. Soldiers wrote of seeing him on horseback, riding among them during marches, or standing silently as they drilled, and they felt in him a strength that steadied their own hearts. In his quiet way, he reminded them that though the struggle was great, it was not beyond endurance. One of the most remembered examples of Washington's leadership in stillness came during the winter at Valley Forge in 1777 and 1778. The army encamped there suffered greatly. The snow lay deep across the hills, the winds were sharp, and the huts built by the soldiers offered little protection from the cold. Many lacked shoes, their feet wrapped in rags that froze and bled against the snow. Food was scarce, supplies irregular, and sickness spread quickly through the crowded camp. For many, it seemed that the army might dissolve altogether under the weight of suffering. And yet, Washington remained with them. He did not retreat to comfort or distance himself from the hardship. He shared it, walking among the soldiers, listening to their complaints, and offering what little encouragement he could. His presence, steady and unshaken, reminded them that they were not abandoned. When Baron von Steuben arrived to train the army, bringing with him a discipline that transformed ragged recruits into soldiers capable of moving and fighting as one, it was Washington's patience that allowed the training to take root. He gave his men the time to learn, the space to grow, and the reassurance that their endurance was not in vain. Valley Forge became more than a winter of suffering. It became a season of transformation. Out of cold and hunger, out of illness and weariness, came an army that was no longer merely a collection of individuals, but a united force. And at the heart of that transformation stood Washington, whose quiet leadership held everything together. His strength was not in loud commands, but in the steady conviction that they must endure, and in showing his men, day after day, that he himself would endure alongside them. Beyond Valley Forge, Washington's leadership continued to be marked by patience and stillness. He understood that the war could not be won by rushing into battles without preparation. He chose carefully when to engage and when to withdraw, balancing the need to show resolve with the need to preserve his army for another day. This caution sometimes frustrated those who wanted quick victories, but in the long view, it was this very patience that allowed the revolution to survive. Washington recognized that the war was as much about endurance as it was about combat, and he guided his men with that understanding always in mind. Even in moments of defeat, when the army was forced to retreat or when hope seemed dim, Washington did not let despair overwhelm him. After the loss of New York in 1776, he calmly reorganized his forces and led them across New Jersey, where, in the stillness of winter, he planned the daring crossing of the Delaware River. On Christmas night, in bitter cold, his men followed him across the icy waters, and their surprise victory at Trenton gave new life to a cause that had seemed in danger of fading. This balance of patience and decisive action, held always in quiet strength, became the hallmark of his command. For the soldiers, Washington became more than a general. He became a symbol of steadiness. In his silence, they felt reassurance. In his dignity, they found pride. In his endurance, they discovered their own. His presence reminded them that the revolution was not simply a dream, but a reality being shaped, day by day, carried forward not by sudden triumphs alone, but by the ability to endure hardship with grace. It is easy, when we look back, to focus on the famous battles, the strategies, and the victories. But perhaps it is just as important to remember the quieter images: Washington standing by a campfire with snow falling softly around him, Washington listening in silence as his officers debated, Washington writing letters by candlelight, his face lit by the soft glow of flame, as he considered not only the needs of the army, but the hopes of a nation. And these were the moments that defined his leadership, the moments of stillness that gave strength to others. As the war stretched on, year after year, Washington's role became not only that of a military leader, but of a steadying presence for the entire cause of independence. The people looked to him as a figure of trust, someone who did not falter when the path grew hard. His patience, his calm, and his refusal to abandon the struggle gave the revolution the time it needed to survive. Without his stillness, the fragile effort might have collapsed under the weight of hardship. With it, the cause endured, slowly, steadily, until the end could at last be seen. And so, when we speak of Washington's greatness, it is not only in his victories that we find it, but in his stillness, in his ability to stand calm in the midst of uncertainty, to remain steady when all around him wavered, and to remind those who followed him that sometimes the greatest strength is found not in loud declarations, but in quiet endurance. The revolution, in many ways, was a long journey through uncertainty, and it was Washington's stillness that guided it through. He became not only the leader of an army, but the embodiment of patience, of steadiness, and of the quiet belief that freedom, though distant, could be reached. And in that stillness, the colonies found their strength. The revolution, though born in the fields and towns of the 13 colonies, was not a struggle carried alone. From the earliest days, leaders such as Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and others understood that the colonies, with their small population and limited resources, could not hope to match the might of Britain without help. Britain was a vast empire, with ships that sailed across the oceans, soldiers trained in discipline, and wealth drawn from trade and colonies around the world. Against such a force, the fragile continental army and the scattered militias of the colonies seemed small indeed. And yet, there was a quiet hope that friends might be found beyond the ocean, friends who shared the belief that liberty was worth supporting, and who saw in the struggle of the Americans not just a distant rebellion, but a cause that could reshape the world. From the very beginning, envoys were sent to Europe, carrying with them not only the news of battles fought and declarations made, but also the hopes of a people who sought recognition. Benjamin Franklin, with his wit, his charm, and his gift for diplomacy, became the face of the American cause abroad. In Paris, he wore simple clothes rather than fine silks, presenting himself not as an aristocrat, but as a man of the people. His appearance, his manner, and his reputation as a thinker and inventor all drew attention, and soon he was welcomed into salons where ideas were exchanged as eagerly as food and drink. There, he spoke of the colonies, of their desire for freedom, of their willingness to endure hardship for the sake of self-governance, and he listened as French men and women, already curious about ideas of liberty, found inspiration in his words. France at first hesitated. The French court was cautious, for though it disliked Britain and saw in the revolution an opportunity to weaken a rival, it also feared the risk of supporting a cause that might fail. Yet as the years passed, and as the Americans continued to fight, the French began to see that this was not a passing disturbance, but a genuine struggle. The victory at Saratoga in 1777 was especially important, for it showed that the colonists could stand against Britain and win. News of that victory crossed the Atlantic, and in its wake, France made its decision. In 1778, a formal alliance was signed, bringing with it supplies, ships, and soldiers. The arrival of French support was not only practical, it was deeply symbolic. For soldiers who had suffered hunger and cold, the sight of French ships entering American harbors, sails wide against the sky, was a reassurance that they were not alone. For communities weary of sacrifice, the knowledge that a great nation recognized their cause gave renewed hope. And for leaders who had long struggled to keep the revolution alive, the alliance with France was proof that their efforts had not been in vain. French officers came to America, some of them young and eager, such as the Marquis de Lafayette. He in particular became beloved, not only for his military skill, but for his genuine devotion to the American cause. He fought alongside Washington, learned from him, and gave his own resources to support the army. His presence was a bridge between the two nations, a reminder that the ideals of liberty could unite people across oceans. The French alliance also brought with it a new sense of possibility. For years, Washington had been forced to balance caution with necessity, engaging only when circumstances allowed and retreating when survival demanded. With French ships controlling parts of the seas and French troops adding their strength, the balance began to shift. Britain, once able to direct its power fully against the colonies, now had to divide its attention, defending its empire in multiple places at once. The war, once centered in America, became part of a larger struggle across the globe, stretching Britain thin and giving the colonies a chance to breathe. And yet, even with this new support, the war did not end quickly. Supplies still ran short, battles still brought hardship, and uncertainty still weighed heavily upon the people. But the knowledge that allies had joined them made each burden easier to bear. It was as if a hand had reached across the ocean, steadying the colonies, reminding them that they were not a solitary voice crying out in the wilderness, but part of a chorus that believed in freedom. For the ordinary soldier, the alliance might have meant little more than an occasional shipment of supplies, a glimpse of French uniforms marching beside them, or the sound of foreign voices speaking words of encouragement. But even these small signs mattered. They were proof that the dream of independence had been heard, that it was not isolated to the fields of New England or the towns of Virginia, but recognized by the world beyond. For the families at home, hearing news of the alliance, there was comfort in knowing that powerful friends had joined their side. It was another reason to endure, another reason to keep faith. In time, this friendship would reach its fullest expression at Yorktown, where French ships closed the harbor and French troops stood alongside Americans in the final great battle of the war. But even before that moment, the alliance was already shaping the course of history. It gave the revolution the strength to continue, and it gave the people the confidence to believe that their sacrifices would not be wasted. The revolution, when seen in this light, was not only an American story. It was a story of connection, of ideas traveling across oceans, of people in distant lands finding inspiration in one another. The friendship of France and America showed that liberty was not the dream of one place alone, but a hope shared by many. And so, as the years of war dragged on and as hardship continued, the knowledge of friends from afar became a source of quiet strength. It reminded the weary soldiers and the patient families that they were part of something larger, something that reached beyond their own fields and towns, something that bound them to others who believed in the same gentle, enduring truth. that freedom, though costly, was worth the struggle. By the autumn of 1781, the long years of the Revolution had left their mark on the land and on the people. Villages that had once been untouched by war now carried scars, fences broken by passing armies, fields left untended because laborers had gone to fight, homes bearing quiet emptiness where fathers, brothers, or sons had not returned. Families had endured season after season of uncertainty. Soldiers had marched through heat and snow alike, and leaders had spent countless nights bent over maps and letters, seeking a way to bring the long struggle to its close. And though independence had been declared years earlier, the path to securing it had been slow and winding, filled with hardships that tested patience and resolve. And yet, through that endurance, the colonies had come to this moment when the possibility of a true end seemed at last within reach. The war had shifted southward in its later years, drawing both British and American forces into Virginia. And there, in the town of Yorktown, General Charles Cornwallis and his British troops established a position along the York River. The town, with its simple houses, warehouses, and wharves, was not remarkable in itself, but its location made it significant. Cornwallis, confident in his defences and in the strength of the British Navy, believed he could hold the town against whatever the Americans might attempt. But events, quietly building across the months, had conspired to surround him. General George Washington, still guiding the Continental Army with his steady hand, saw in Yorktown an opportunity. With the help of French allies, soldiers under the command of the Comte de Rochambeau, and ships commanded by Admiral de Grasse, a plan was formed. The French fleet would block the British by sea, cutting off escape and resupply, while American and French troops would converge on land. It was a plan that required patience, secrecy, and perfect timing, but it was also a plan that, if successful, might bring the long war to its quiet conclusion. As the combined armies marched southward, the soldiers felt the weight of what lay before them. For years they had endured, fighting battles that often seemed to lead back to the same weary ground, victories followed by defeats, hopes followed by disappointments. Now, as they moved steadily toward Yorktown, there was a sense that perhaps, at last, they were walking toward an ending. The roads were dusty in the autumn sun, the nights cool with the approach of winter, and the men carried with them not only muskets and packs, but also memories of all that had passed. The hunger of Valley Forge, the victories that had lifted them, the losses that had scarred them. Each step was a reminder that they were still standing, still moving forward. When the American and French armies reached Yorktown, they began the slow work of laying siege. Earthworks were dug, cannon were positioned, and trenches stretched across the fields, moving closer and closer to the British defences. The work was hard, carried out by weary men under the threat of enemy fire, yet there was a quiet determination in it. Each shovelful of earth, each log placed into a barricade, was not just preparation for battle, but a step toward the end of years of struggle. The French fleet, true to plan, held the waters, preventing British ships from reaching Cornwallis. Inside the town, the British found themselves increasingly isolated, their supplies dwindling, their position weakening with each passing day. Cornwallis, once confident, began to feel the weight of inevitability pressing down. The sound of cannon fire echoed across the fields as the American and French guns opened, their thunder rolling day and night, shaking the ground and filling the air with smoke. For the soldiers in the trenches, the noise became constant, yet within it was also a sense of progress, a recognition that the walls of Yorktown were slowly giving way. In those days of siege, life was both tense and strangely steady. Soldiers worked by day, digging, carrying, firing, and then rested in shifts, their bodies weary but their spirits held by the knowledge that this effort was leading somewhere. In the camps, fires glowed at night, and men shared stories, songs, and quiet reflections as if already sensing that they were living in the final chapter of their long ordeal. Washington himself walked among the lines, observing the progress, his presence steady as always, reminding the men that their endurance was not wasted. Lafayette, Rochambeau, and other leaders moved with purpose, their coordination with Washington a sign of the unity that had brought them to this place. As the trenches drew closer, the bombardment grew heavier until the British defences were crumbling. And Cornwallis, unable to break free by sea and unwilling to see his men destroyed by continued fire, considered his options. On October 17, 1781, he sent out a drummer, followed by a soldier carrying a white handkerchief on a pole, signalling his wish to surrender. For those who saw it, the moment carried with it a stillness unlike any other. The thunder of cannon fell silent, the smoke began to clear, and a hush spread across the fields. After years of noise, of hardship, of uncertainty, there was suddenly quiet. The terms of surrender were arranged, and on October 19th, the British laid down their arms. Lines of soldiers, once proud and disciplined, now marched slowly to give up their weapons, their faces heavy with the knowledge of defeat. For the Americans and the French, it was a victory, yet it was not marked by wild celebration. Instead, it was marked by relief, by the deep breath of a people who had endured too long and who now felt the weight begin to lift. The war was not formally over. Negotiations and treaties would still be needed, but in that moment, at Yorktown, the heart of the conflict had ended. For the ordinary soldiers who had carried muskets and dug trenches, who had marched across states and waited through long winters, Yorktown was the sign that their sacrifices had not been in vain. For the families at home, who had lived with absence and uncertainty, it was the promise that life might return to its familiar rhythms. For Washington, it was the fulfillment of years of patience and endurance, a victory not only of arms but of spirit. When we remember Yorktown now, it is often as a decisive battle, a moment of triumph. But perhaps it is gentle also to remember it as a moment of stillness, when the noise of war gave way to silence, when men laid down their weapons, and when the long struggle of endurance found its quiet conclusion. The fields that had echoed with cannon fire grew silent again, the river that had carried ships flowed peacefully, once more, and the air, though still heavy with smoke, carried also the first breaths of peace. The revolution had not been swift. It had not been easy. It had been a long and patient struggle, carried by people who endured hunger, cold, fear, and loss. And at Yorktown, their endurance found its reward. The surrender was not the end of hardship, but it was the end of doubt. Independence, once only a hope, had become something real. And so, as the sun set over Yorktown on those October days, casting its light across the fields and reflecting on the waters of the river, the people of America stepped quietly into a new season. The war was nearly over, the dream was nearly won, and the long night of conflict was giving way to the dawn of peace. When the guns fell silent at Yorktown in the autumn of 1781, there was a deep sense that the long struggle had reached its turning point. Soldiers stood in quiet ranks as the British surrendered. Families in distant towns heard the news with relief, and leaders who had carried the heavy weight of responsibility allowed themselves at last to imagine that the war might be drawing to its end. Yet even as the surrender gave hope, the work was not finished. Peace had to be secured, treaties had to be signed, and the colonies, no longer bound to the crown, had to discover what it truly meant to be a nation of their own. For nearly 2 years after Yorktown, negotiations continued. Diplomats in Paris sat around tables with maps spread before them, speaking in calm tones, weighing interests, and writing drafts of agreements that would eventually bring the war to its final conclusion. These talks were not swift, for nations beyond Britain and America had their own concerns, France, Spain, and the Netherlands all had interests in the balance of power, and each sought to protect what it had gained or hoped to gain. Yet through all the long conversations, the essential fact remained clear. The colonies had secured their independence, and the world would soon recognize it. In September of 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. The document, like the Declaration years earlier, carried a significance far greater than the ink on its pages. It marked the formal end of the war and the recognition by Britain that the United States was now free and independent. For the people of the young nation, the treaty was more than words. It was the quiet confirmation that the sacrifices of years had not been in vain, that the long nights of uncertainty had led to a dawn of possibility. Yet the end of war was only the beginning of another journey. For independence did not mean that all challenges had been solved. It meant, instead, that the colonies, now states, had to learn how to govern themselves, how to work together, and how to build something lasting out of the fragile unity that the Revolution had created. The Articles of Confederation, which had guided them during the war, proved too weak to hold the states firmly together, and debates began over how to create a stronger framework. These debates, quiet in tone but heavy in importance, filled halls and meeting rooms as men spoke of representation, of balance, of the rights of states and the powers of a central government. The Constitution would come later, shaped by compromise and vision, but even in those early years, the seeds of the nation's future were already being planted. For the ordinary people, the return of peace meant a return to rhythms long interrupted. Farmers turned once more to their fields, without fear of armies crossing them. Merchants opened shops with renewed hope, their shelves slowly filling again with goods. Families that had been divided by absence were reunited, and children who had grown during the war learned to know fathers who had been away for years. Towns that had carried scars of battle repaired fences, rebuilt homes, and replanted orchards, their landscapes slowly healing along with the hearts of their people. Still, peace did not erase all hardship. The war had left debts to be paid, wounds to be tended, and divisions to be healed. Some who had remained loyal to Britain faced suspicion or hostility, and many chose to leave, carrying their belongings to Canada, to England, or to other places where they might begin anew. Soldiers who had given years of service returned home to find farms in need of work, tools in need of repair, and communities in need of rebuilding. Widows and orphans carried on with quiet strength, their losses a reminder that independence had been dearly bought. Yet through all of this, there was also a sense of resilience, of determination to shape a future that justified the sacrifices of the past. The new nation was fragile, yet it was filled with possibility. Its people were diverse in background, belief, and interest, yet they were united by the experience of endurance. They had learned through long years of struggle that patience and perseverance could carry them through hardship, and now those same qualities would be needed to build a nation. The Revolution had given them freedom, but it had also given them responsibility, the responsibility to govern wisely, to treat one another with fairness, and to nurture the fragile bond of unity that independence required. It is gentle, too, to remember that the Revolution was not only a story of leaders and armies, but of countless ordinary people whose names are not recorded in history books. It was the farmer who tilled the field alone, while his son marched with the army. It was the mother who spun cloth late into the night to clothe her family when supplies ran thin. It was the child who fetched water, tended animals, and grew quickly under the weight of tasks that war had placed upon small shoulders. It was the neighbor who shared food when another had none, the community that gathered to rebuild after soldiers had passed, the quiet acts of kindness and resilience that gave the struggle its true strength. And these people, whose lives unfolded in ordinary ways, were the true foundation of the new nation. And so, as the years after the war unfolded, the United States took its first gentle steps into the world. They were uncertain steps, filled with questions and challenges, yet they were also steps of hope. The people had endured much, but they had also discovered within themselves a strength they had not known before. They had learned that freedom was not given, but earned, and that it could be nurtured with patience, care, and faith. When we look back now, it is tempting to see the revolution as a series of grand events, the signing of declarations, the clash of battles, the surrender at Yorktown. But it is perhaps just as true and just as calming to see it as a series of quiet moments, a pen scratching on paper, a soldier warming himself by a fire, a family gathered in prayer for safety, a community working together to rebuild. These moments, gentle and steady, are what gave shape to the nation. And as the sun rose each morning in the years after the war, casting its light over farms, towns, rivers, and forests, the people of the new United States awoke to the knowledge that they were free. Their nation was young, their challenges many, but their hope was strong. Each day carried with it the chance to build something lasting, to walk forward in the long path of self-governance, and to pass on to their children a country shaped by the endurance, patience, and quiet courage of those who had lived through the revolution. The revolution had begun with hesitant shots on a village green, carried through years of hardship, and ended with treaties signed in distant halls. Yet its truest story was always one of people, of ordinary lives lived, with extraordinary endurance. And in the first gentle steps of the United States, we see the continuation of that story, a reminder that the greatest changes in history often grow not from sudden bursts of glory, but from the slow, steady work of men and women who believe in something larger than themselves. And so, as we close this chapter, let us picture the new nation not in the noise of battle or the drama of politics, but in the quiet scenes of daily life. A field newly ploughed, a marketplace slowly filling with goods, a family gathered around a fire, a child falling asleep with the knowledge that the world is now different, freer, and full of promise. In these small, steady images, the revolution finds its truest ending, not in noise but in stillness, not in haste but in patience, not in destruction but in the gentle work of beginning anew.